recently about a brilliant young engineer who made it a condition of his employment that his desk be made entirely out of Lego. Has anyone heard that one? Or what about the security company who was starting to wonder whether the reason they were having trouble attracting women into their leadership pipeline might have had something to do with the fact that all of their advertisements and imagery around what leadership looked like featured a lot of beefy men with big guns. My name's Clare Moncrieff. As you heard, I'm a principal executive advisor at CEB, and I hear stories like this all the time. As you know, CEB is the world's leading membership-based advisory firm. And in my job, I have the privilege of talking to HR directors and leaders all around the world on a daily basis about the challenges that they face in HR. And this year, at the request of our members, we've been asked to turn our attention in our research to several critical talent segments that are of particular interest to, but also concern for heads of HR. And today I want to share a couple of insights on just two of those, millennials and women in leadership. Now, we know there's clearly been quite a lot published already around these two segments, so we had no intention of adding to the landfill of irrelevant insights around millennials and women in leadership. Instead, we want to take a very narrow focus around what myths we've commonly heard voiced that might derail some of the work you're doing to both attract and retain millennials and advance the careers of women, and to give you our informed and objective view around what you need to be doing instead. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And what you'll see is that with millennials, we don't necessarily understand them, and we don't always know what to do with them. And with women in leadership, we think we understand them, and we think we know what to do, but we're actually largely wrong. So let me start with a little bit of context here. Millennials, also known as Gen Y, were born between 1980 and 2000, an increasing segment of our workforce. You can see a quote here on the right from a head of HR and professional services. By 2020, millennials will fill half our leadership positions. This is not long-term investing. It's investing in the near term. Half of our leadership positions. Let me give you a little more data around that here. Left of the page, you can see that the number of millennials in the workforce is only increasing, and as baby boomers retire, they're increasingly replacing them in not only the workforce broadly, but manager and leadership ranks as well. Good news associated with that on the right-hand side, millennials are the most educated generation we've ever had in the workforce. So clearly, we should be paying attention to this growing and educated segment of our employee population, but the advice that we've been getting around how to manage millennials, you'll see some of that advice here, has been inconsistent and largely unhelpful. According to the sampling of quotes we've pulled from different business and general media sources in recent years, millennials are vacation-seeking, tech-dependent, job-hopping, wealth and fame-obsessed, lazy narcissists who've been stupefied by technology. Or, on the other hand, they're socially responsible organizational saviors who are really no different from the baby boomers who went before them. How on earth do you sift through all of these headlines and quips about this generation and get to some actionable information? What are critical myths about millennials that we need to better understand so that we can effectively manage this population? I'll come back to a couple of those myths shortly. But I want to also give you some context on women in leadership, because that situation is similarly challenging. Now, women in leadership, very hot topic right now. And again, as we saw with millennials, companies are very right to focus on this group. I think we all know women are underrepresented in leadership teams today. We heard Gurnik reference that already. Why is that? Is it because women somehow lack the key behaviors and skills that they need to be successful leaders today? That is not the case. In fact, this data clearly says they do not lack competence. The data on the left-hand side, that pie chart shows you there is no discernible difference in the effectiveness in critical leadership competencies by gender. In fact, for 2% of the competencies, women are even more effective than men. And it's not just that women leaders provide a great deal of capability in their roles, they also provide stability as well. And the data on the right-hand side gives you some very interesting data around, as we look at male leaders in terms of turnover risk to your organization, almost 1 in 5 is looking for a new job in the next year, slightly fewer are actively thinking of quitting, and almost 1 in 10 is actively looking right now. Now, when you think about those same activities as they apply to women, their intention to leave is about 1/3 less. than it is for men. So our conclusion from this page is that women provide competence and strength to the organization in general and to leadership ranks in particular. And organizations with female leaders also drive better financial results. We clearly see the impact of outcomes when it comes to increasing the representation of women in leadership roles. A recent study here from Fortune showed that companies receive on average 103.4% return during the tenure of women CEOs, compared to just a 69.5% average return for the S&P 500 in that same period. Or Credit Suisse recently put out a report a few months ago, found that companies with one or more women on the board see an average return on equity that's 4 percentage points higher than boards without any female members. I could go on and on here, quoting multiple sources that have been studying various dimensions of these issues over the last couple of years, reaching a very similar set of conclusions in terms of not only the direct impact on the bottom line, but also finding that increased female representation helps companies get ahead of the customer needs, anticipate risks, challenge the thinking of their peers. I certainly, though, am not here to suggest we haven't been doing anything on women in leadership so far. In fact, on the left, 8 out of 10 heads of diversity and inclusion have gender diversity as a key part of their agenda. But we're not satisfied with the results that we're getting from our investments. The data on the right here shows that 40% of heads of HR think their gender diversity strategies are effective. So, of course, that means that over half of them do not think that their gender strategies are effective. But I'm guessing you're not in this session because you wanted to know whether increasing representation of millennials or women in leadership in your organizations is a worthy goal, but actually because you want to know more about how to do it. So let me look at the 4 myths I want to debunk for you today. Here are the 4 myths that are out there in the popular press, 2 about millennials there on the left-hand side, 2 on the right-hand side about women in leadership. I'm going to go through each of these in turn over the next couple of pages, starting with this first myth on the far left of your page, which is that millennials are more collaborative than they are competitive. Not true. In fact, millennials are the most competitive generation in the workforce today. However, they're competing to be the best relatively, not absolutely. So what does that mean? It means that they're not internally driven to constantly strive for higher levels of performance, and we'll explore a little bit more about that shortly, but they are driven to be better than others. Second myth is the general opinion that millennials want to organization hop, that they're fundamentally incapable of staying in one organization for any length of time, and they have this natural desire to kind of go out there and try new organizations all the time. That's not actually what we found in our survey data. They do like to move, but it's actually about experiences, not necessarily new companies. Shifting to the third piece here, women in leadership, this third myth is that women just don't aspire to leadership roles, and that's why we don't see very many of them up at the top. We'll see shortly it's actually not aspiration that women lack, especially early and mid-career. It's more visibility into leadership opportunities that's missing. And this fourth myth here on the right-hand side is that flexibility is somehow a sign of weakness or a signal that you're lacking in leadership capability. But in fact, shunning flexibility is not the answer. The answer is to make flexible work schedules the default for all levels, and by the way, for all genders. And it's not only something that's offered under special circumstances. Let me just start now with the first of these. So, common opinion here, expressed by other generations, is that millennials are simply more collaborative by nature. You see here the kind of opinions that we've often heard voiced by our members and we've seen in the press. I'm sure this will look very familiar to all of you, that we need to design workspaces differently for millennials. We need to adjust the environment for their collaborative nature. You know, they're just not as competitive. And that this basically is because they were all raised in packs. They were socialized to be collaborative from the very beginning. Take a look at this data. Now, what we're looking at here is what you might think of as a competition index. It's actually from one of the newest members of the CEB family, SHL, and it essentially measures the competitive spirit in employees. And when we compare responses from different generations, millennials are in the black box here. Clearly, the competitive spirit is alive and well in millennials. In fact, they're more competitive than Gen X or baby boomers. However, their competitive nature is driven externally rather than internally. Let me show you data here. Millennials really care about how they compare to each other. Have a look to the left. When we asked employees in our global survey about whether they compare their performance to the performance of their peers, millennials are much more predisposed to want to do those peer-to-peer comparisons. Almost 6 out of 10 are competitive about their relative performance, 10% more than other generations. But they're significantly less concerned about their absolute performance. The bars on the right reflect the percentage of employees who say that doing their job well is not good enough. So basically, this is getting to, are you intrinsically likely to be an overperformer? And while they're more competitive, they're not necessarily as internally motivated to overperform. Other generations are much more inclined to say that being adequate is not good enough, while only a quarter of millennials would say the same. Now, if I just flip that around the other way, that means 3/4 of millennials are okay with good enough in absolute terms. So what's our takeaway in this first myth? We really need to reignite their relative competitive nature by creating more opportunities for millennials to compare their performance to others. So, millennials are actually more competitive than other generations. What about their mobility? Is it true that they want to organization hop? Let me share a little insight into why we think it's about experience hopping rather than organization hopping. And I'm going to start on the left here, looking at the percentage of respondents by generation who selected each of these attributes as one of the top 5 reasons that they would consider changing employers. And I do realize, by the way, that some of you in the back may not have bionic vision. So these slides are going to be available through the app, through Changeboard tomorrow. So I see lots of you taking pictures. Don't worry, you'll have access to all this data. But on the left here, millennials are in the more bright blue, the taller bars, essentially. And the attributes we're asking here are about future career opportunity, development opportunity, and organization growth rate. So we asked, which of those is a top reason why you would consider changing employers? And here, when we look at specifically at items related to career advancement, which is the tallest bar on the left, we can see they're significantly more focused on career advancement than other generations. So when you look at this data on the right, the percentage of respondents who say that they will look externally for another job over the next year, we see that just over half of millennials report that they will. But you have to step back and consider that data in light of the data on the left-hand side of the page. To what extent is this looking for other jobs actually based on the fact that they have a desire for more career and development opportunities? Because in fact, they're actually very willing to look for those opportunities internally if they're given the chance. The data on the left shows that millennials find internal opportunities desirable, but right now, they may just not be finding them. So just as our myth around competition suggested we need to feed their desire to compete with others, the commitment myth here suggests that we need to feed their desire for learning opportunities. The quote on the right here says, millennials are looking for mentors. They're looking for growth. We need to help them find those opportunities internally so that they don't need to hop organizations in order to realize them. And the good news here is that it's about experience. It's not just about promotion. In fact, here on this page, we did want to understand what exactly millennials are looking for when it came to career development opportunities. What's going to have the biggest impact on their commitment? And what you can see in this bar graph is that they really want to move laterally. It's not only about moving straight up. They're looking for a diversity of career moves across the organization. Simply having an accelerated promotion path isn't enough to keep them from leaving your organization. Career progress and promotions are not necessarily the same thing for millennials. So, what's the implication here? For HR leaders, we need to help millennials find and realize the benefits of diverse career moves within their own organizations. Now, 2 popular conceptions about millennials I've been through here. Turns out both of them are not true. What about women in leadership? Conventional wisdom, like you see here in a quote from a Bloomberg blog, is that women have less natural interest, a lower willingness to do whatever it takes to get to the top. But our data clearly disproves that. In fact, we at CB Corporate Leadership Council have been measuring the aspiration levels of employees for several years now, meaning how interested are they in continuing to rise to senior roles in the organization, and how willing are they to make the trade-offs that come with that upward movement. And our findings, split out by men versus women, are outlined on this page. Let me just orient you to what we're looking at here, starting on the left with that line graph. The horizontal axis is looking at employees at different levels of the organization. The vertical axis represents the percentage of employees with high levels of aspiration. So what we're looking for here is the level of aspiration and whether it is different at different levels across the organization, and most importantly, whether it's different for women versus men. And by the way, women are in the darker blue line over there. So what is the data telling us? It says women and men have almost exactly the same levels of aspiration at every level in the organization. There is no aspiration gap when it comes to women in leadership roles. So they may want it, but maybe they're not willing to do what it takes to get it. That's what we're looking at on the right, because again, conventional wisdom suggests that while women aspire to leadership roles theoretically, their personal priorities compete with career priorities, and in the end, they're just not willing to do what it takes to rise, to accept the challenges that are generally perceived to be key to gaining leadership skills. So we looked at one kind of challenge in particular with rising leaders, and one that they're often presented with, which is, would you take a stretch assignment? Like a new role in a different function or a new industry, new skills that you need to leverage. We asked that question to men and women in our survey. How willing would you be to accept that kind of stretch assignment? Once again, pretty much exactly the same levels of receptivity from women versus men. In fact, if anything, women are slightly more willing to take these stretch assignments. Now, certainly, there are going to be situations for men as well as for women where stretch assignments are not going to be possible. But the data here disproves the assumption that women don't have the aspiration or the willingness to rise to senior leadership roles. What they actually lack is the right level of visibility into leadership opportunities. We looked at the intent to stay for women with low versus high visibility into career opportunities, and the exact survey question reflected here is, I am confident I will have a successful career at my organization. For women who responded in the negative, only 10% have a high intent to stay. That's the first bar there on the left-hand side. But for women who responded affirmatively, over half have a high intent to stay. So seeing that path, seeing those career opportunities very clearly has a five-fold impact on their intent to stay with your company. However, on the right-hand side as it stands today, only a third of women see those career opportunities at their organization. So the implication here, I think, is pretty visible, right? Make career opportunities visible to women in the workforce. Providing that visibility is one key way to support the advancement of women. But what else advances their career development? Now, I'm going to share some data with you. Starting with this piece here, we asked women leaders about a range of different things that could potentially help them with their career progression, and we asked them which of these things would be most impactful to helping women advance their careers. Now, I want you to think about the kinds of things you do in your company right now to support women in their careers. This bar on the screen here is something most of us do. Have women groups where women can get together and support each other in their careers. The height of this bar is showing us that just 1% of women are currently finding those groups helpful in terms of advancing their careers. What else do we do to support the careers of women? Let me hear a couple things. What do you do to support women's career advancement? Yeah, that's one. I'll come back to it. Mentorship. Yeah. Coaching. How about coaching? Let's take a look at this. Only 6% of women find that helpful as they advance their careers. I heard better mentoring. 10% of women say this is helpful. How about holding leaders accountable for gender diversity? Huge topic I'm discussing with heads of D&I right now. Yeah, 11%, right? Impact. What's the number one thing we can do to support women's careers? You had it right here in row 3, flexible time schedule. Now, I haven't shown you all the items we tested, but number one by a wide margin was flexible time schedule. It was picked twice as much as things like gender diversity initiatives, holding leaders accountable for gender diversity, coaching, and mentoring. So the message here is sort of, okay, stop talking about it. Give me something that practically makes a difference in my everyday life. And on the right-hand side of this slide, we pulled out a couple of things from our data we found quite interesting in our analysis. First, that only 15% of male leaders chose flexible time schedules as the most important tool to helping the career progression of women. And HR leaders were even further off in their perceptions. They ranked flexibility as the 5th most critical initiative after coaching, mentoring, networking, and maternity leave policies. But women themselves, at all levels, chose flexibility as the #1 thing that will help them progress their careers. That includes things like staggered hours within a fixed schedule, a variable day schedule, ability to take longer midday breaks, even a compressed work week. And our research shows that flex time doesn't just matter theoretically. We can measure the impact on retention here as well. When women are satisfied with workplace flexibility, their intention to stay more than doubles. When women are satisfied versus dissatisfied, you can see the numbers here. A 30 percentage point increase to nearly 50% of women with high intent to stay when they're satisfied with the level of flexibility at work. So a huge driver of retention for women. And women also cite it as a key driver for their career progression. So our implication here, lack of flexibility is often a derailer for women as they rise in the leadership ranks. And even the use of flexible arrangements can be seen as a sign of weakness or a lack of aspiration. Making flexibility the norm rather than an exception destigmatizes it. It creates an organizational environment in which women can grow into and really thrive in leadership roles. Okay, so there you have it. 4 myths, 4 corresponding database truths, and 4 implications for you to work on as you think about managing these critical talent segments. To help you after the day today, I've summarized key takeaways for you about both millennials and women in leadership. So as you reflect on that engineer with his Lego desk, for example, that might work if it is cooler than everybody else's desk, of course. With that, let me see if there are any questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much. So we're going to have a go with our most significant talent segment for your organization. What do we have? So what you're saying in the room is high potential employees. Why is this changing slightly? High potential.
I guess people are still voting.
They're still voting. I thought the vote was closed. It's still happening, is it? Still happening.
Real-time voting.
It is real-time voting. So it keeps changing all the time. You can get the idea. High potentials seem to be getting more and more. You didn't necessarily talk. Women may fall into, of course, high potentials and millennials.
Millennials could also fall into, yep. So but we have done lots of research on high potential employees, and you won't be surprised to hear that the vast majority of HR budget is currently allocated to leadership development. I don't think anybody's going to be too surprised to hear that. Also, you may not be surprised to hear we're not necessarily seeing the returns we want from that investment today in terms of the development of leadership skills and capabilities that are needed in this complex work environment that was already referenced before me.
Yeah, we talked about that a little bit earlier. Just want to catch up just very quickly on this idea of flexibility because I'm fascinated by this. How do you change that you talk about default, flexibility as default, but what if the current leadership, basically, they turn up at 7 o'clock in the morning, they leave at 7 or 8 in the evening, they go out on the golf course. How do you change that?
Well, I mean, there's actually, in the full research, we actually do get into some best practice case examples of what companies have done around that, and there is an element of role modeling there. So helping current leaders understand that it's not okay necessarily if you want your team to be working flexibly for you to not ever work flexibly. And in fact, we've seen some really nice examples where leaders have said, I want you to work from home, and therefore I am also going to work from home 2 days a week. So you can see that it's okay. And you can observe me doing it and know that I'm not just saying it, I'm doing it. But actually then helping make that culture change and changing that mindset is a huge, interesting topic that companies are working on right now. And there are some very innovative ideas out there. I'm going to stick around, by the way, through lunch, so I'm happy to discuss that with people that are interested in learning more about it.
One last question, because I know you've done some research on that. You talked about high potentials and not necessarily getting the returns from the leadership development. What, in your interest, and given us some research on this, what are the key elements for leadership that you think will help people to thrive today, not as business was 10, 20 years ago, but actually today?
Well, Grenik and I were actually talking about that before we came up this morning, and one of the interesting things that we agree on is that the capabilities and skills that leaders have largely haven't changed, and by the way, they're largely the right ones. What's changed is the context, and he talked about this incredibly complex world that we find ourselves in today. So if you think about it, the challenge is less about acquiring new skills, and it's more about applying the skills you have in a context that is completely new and different to you. And so as we think about what skills leaders need, it's often not necessarily only about learning agility, it's actually a lot about application agility. How good are you at applying your skills to situations that you've never been in before, that no one in your company's ever been in before, that your company has never been in before? And that's really the ability to apply in very unusual contexts is one of the critical things we see differentiating leadership development today.
Okay, Clare Moncrieff, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you.